Hey all, so pretty excited about this one, but I suspected kind of early on that this was possible, but it took me a little bit to get a couple of these down and to figure out the best strategy for it. But it is possible to solo the Summer of Pain EMP mod Mr. Sinister with every single member of the Fantastic Four, and that's what we're going to do here today. Now, first off is Thing, because he is by far the most boring. This is very similar to the Doom fight that I showed earlier, where he's shock immune. He has no way to gain specials, he doesn't really mitigate the healing in any way. It's just very difficult for Sinister to kill him. So, what you'll notice that I'm doing here is that early on, I am parrying an extra time to get to 20 rock stacks and then staying away from him so that the rock stacks fall off on their own. Because if I parry again because I don't have the torch synergy and I don't have any power to throw specials, then they will just refresh to 20. But by letting them fall off, I actually build Furies. So this is much slower than a normal fight where you would probably use specials or maybe the Human Torch synergy to build up his Furies. Because doing them 5 at a time is kind of a pain like this. But it does mean that you can reach his full ramp, you're just going to take a little bit of block damage. This would obviously be easier with a rank 3, but I don't have a rank 3, and if I did, they probably wouldn't be SIG 200, which you're going to see come into play later. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and speed up most of the rest of this. So, like I said, this is actually pretty similar to the Doom fight, and it came out a very similar length and actually pretty close on the number of hits, even though this thing is a rank 5 5-star and my Doctor Doom is a rank 3 6-star. So, if you have a thing, then that's pretty cool. What you'll notice is that there are a couple times in here that I have pushed him to his L2, and as long as you don't let it hit you, right, then it's free willpower healing. So right there, because this was the only run I did with Thing, which tells you how easy he is, you'll see that I think I slightly mistimed an evade of the L1 and ended up blocking it. And I noticed that it triggered protection, which I wasn't sure would happen because it kind of felt like with the Rogue last week and then this Mr. Sinister, that they were actually specifically calibrating these bosses to avoid the Thing cheese that you see in Incursions, where he's just constantly proccing protection through block and therefore basically immune to damage. And it sounds like they did that for a lot of things, but because so much of Mr. Sinister's special damage is concentrated in just 2 hits of his L1, that does proc protection. And so from there on out, because I know how much health I have to work with, I actually switched to exclusively parrying the L1s, both because I knew it wouldn't do any damage, but also to practice for the other fights that I end up taking where I have to parry a lot of L1s. So I was basically just making sure I had the animation. So like I said, if you feel you get low with Thing, then you can just try and push Sinister to an L2, and as long as you have that evade down, then it's free willpower healing to get you back up a little bit. You could, with that in mind, intentionally block more hits and drop below 50% to trigger Courage and make this whole thing go faster. I didn't really feel like dealing with that. Like I said, this was my first and only run, so I was playing kind of carefully. Up here, I'm going to slow it down for a minute to show you one exception to that, but it also highlights just how safe it is to use Thing. And that is that I ran into his special one, but because I was keeping myself at 15 rock stacks, it triggered the unstoppable, and therefore I was able to block the second hit, which triggered protection, and therefore did almost no damage and did not land a degen. So even getting hit barely hurt Thing. And if that had put me in the danger zone and I was worried I didn't have enough health to continue, like I talked about, I just could have pushed him to the L2 again. Luckily, most of Thing's damage scaling comes from those Furies, which we got out of the way early. and he has a relatively low crit rate, which means that most of his hits are going to actually be doing damage to Sinister. Um, However, he will still crit because I did not bother changing my masteries to turn off precision and cruelty. If you do, then these fights are easier, but that's really expensive. Like, it costs a handful of units to take off Dex and then put it back on. To completely redo the offensive mastery tree, if you're like me and you run any points in Deep Wounds or Despair or any of those other premium masteries, then taking off precision and cruelty is expensive. It's basically like switching into the attrition masteries. So I didn't bother with that. This could have gone faster if I had, but like I said, wasn't really worried about it because as you can see, Thing is just incredibly safe here. This is a SIG 200 thing, so every time I trigger protection with 20 rock stacks for those specials, I am taking either 1 or 0 damage on the block. Super, super tanky. And as you saw earlier, even if you do mess this up, as long as you're keeping your rock stacks at 15 with those parries, even if you actually get hit, you likely have room to recover. So very slow fight, but like I said, actually arguably safer even than Doom, just because of how tanky a high sig Thing is. And here's the amazing part. It was actually a little bit faster. I checked and my Doom fight took like 560 hits or something, and this is 528. I was not expecting that, especially because of the rank difference, like I said, but pretty cool. So next up we have Human Torch. Many of you may have seen Buddy Lee's excellent breakdown on whether to use the pre-fight or not. I did test both. Funnily enough, I think that the fact that Buddy runs Liquid Courage and Double Edge actually skews the results of that race, because for me, using the pre-fight actually slowed down the fight. This one that I'm showing you took 100 hits, and with the pre-fight it was 104, whereas for Buddy it was pretty decisive that using the pre-fight made it faster. And I think that's because, as he said with that, the larger the health pool, the more reflecting the smolders, reflecting the active incinerates to turn them into smolders and boost your damage, the more that matters, which is what not using the pre-fights gives you, as you can see. We're up to 41 so far. And if you are not running those masteries that boost your attack by 60% together, then the opponent effectively has a larger health pool. And while Liquid Courage and Double Edge boost the damage that your base incinerates do, and probably boost the damage that the power stings do as well, they do not, I'm pretty confident that it doesn't affect the scaling from the smolders as well. And so the more of those you have, the less important those masteries are, and the faster not using the pre-fight takes the lead. Still, this is a pretty interesting fight. You'll notice throughout this that while often the spacing will work out such that you can safely heavy Sinister after parrying the second hit of his L1, I found it significantly safer to throw a light attack first and put me in range so that I knew I was going to hit him. Now, I did not turn off Dex for this fight, as I believe may have already been proven. I think I may have accidentally Dexed earlier and proc some shocks, which is why I'm so low. But there is a timing in there where you can dodge it such that you can avoid the first hit and parry the second without triggering Dex. Now, I do want to speak to one very important thing here, which is that you kind of need the AI to play along with you. Because in this video and in a lot of the torch runs that you see on YouTube, it feels like every time you knock down Sinister with that heavy against the wall, he is instantly going to throw the L1. Because in successful runs, that happens. But there are times when he just stands back up and blocks for a little bit, and then he'll like run at you, and you have to parry to avoid dexing, or maybe you mess up and do just straight dex, and then he throws the L1 and you're nowhere near the wall, and now you have to play with the spacing. Maybe you ended up triggering some shocks on you and that whole thing. Maybe you ended up pushing him to his L2, which is actually a good thing because you can get some willpower healing and avoid the shocks, but now you have to get him back to the wall, and maybe it just gets away from you. And so my point here is that if you are trying to recreate solos like this, Torch is an excellent option, but it does depend on how the enemy AI behaves, and so don't beat yourself up too much if you're having trouble reproducing this, or if you're wondering, why doesn't this fight look like all the ones that I'm doing on YouTube? Because I definitely had ones where he was not nearly as nice. And that is exactly why my first video on this week's boss was focusing on the safest options, which were Doom and Sunspot, and now, actually, I think I would add Thing to that list, especially if you have him at high sig. But these others are fun solos. They are clearly possible solos, as you can see, and I'm not the only one to get a few of these, but they are a little trickier, and there is some RNG involved in them, so just keep that in mind when trying to reproduce them. With that in mind, let's go ahead and move on to this next one. Some of you have probably seen Metal Sonic Dude's version of this fight, and he, of course, is excellent. One thing I noticed he did not do was use the pre-fight, and my guess is because it depletes your force field and therefore makes the fight, quote, less safe. But the thing is that with this fight, you're not planning on blocking any hits at all because it'll reset your fragility stacks. So the force field doesn't really matter. If the force field ends up mattering, you probably just lost a lot of progress, and if you're going for a solo, you might want to restart anyway, or at least it's going to take much longer. Therefore, I don't think there's really any reason not to use the pre-fight, because it drains your force field, but it also boosts your damage. And I noticed that we both used rank 4 Invisible Women, and mine actually has slightly fewer hits. Without going through and counting, I have no idea what our relative crit luck was. That probably would have affected it. The thing about Invisible Woman is that as you get deeper into the fight, you actually want her to crit more, because even though Sinister is healing for more than the base damage of the crit, the direct damage she does because of the fragility debuffs also scales with those hits, and so that ends up with you doing more damage. So it's possible one or the other of us may have been luckier with crits in the right places, and that could have skewed that count. Point again being, though, that I do think her pre-fight is worth it here, and I find that quite interesting because, honestly, I forget she has a pre-fight sometimes, even as much as I love the Fantastic Four team. I just don't use her very much. I'm still hoping that she gets buffed because the other three are all incredible champions right now, and I feel like she, unfortunately, is more relegated to niche fights like this, where it just happens that her kit lines up and you can get away with playing perfectly over a long period of time. Still, this is definitely a cool fight. I enjoyed it quite a bit. There aren't a lot of places where you can open her up. With that said, though, I'm going to go ahead and speed up the rest of this fight because it all basically follows the same theory. Don't get hit. Hit him. Use her special dodge power to avoid both his basics and his specials without having to block. I did turn dexterity off for this, as you can tell, because I'm not proccing any buffs. And if he does not have a bar of power, then you can backdraft him pretty safely. If he's not actively attacking, you can hit into his block, and either that will cause him to, run into you. You can get some intercepts like I did just there. I could have actually finished that combo. Or if you hit into his block and then back off the right way, he will sometimes throw a heavy, and that gives you your opening there. Or maybe he doesn't give you an opening and you just keep hitting into his block, right? Either way, you're going to get through him. As long as you don't get hit, this is an extremely straightforward fight, and there's not a lot of variation to it. And there we go. 230 hits. Not too bad, especially compared to some of the slower options like Doom and Thing. Obviously, it does require you to change your masteries, so I don't necessarily recommend it if you have a better option like Sunspot or Doom or Thing or any of those others. But for some of you out there who like using Invisible Woman and are willing to pay the mastery cost, that was kind of a fun fight, so I recommend it. This last one was, in my opinion, the hardest. And that is because there is a fair amount of AI involved, and more than any of the other fights, which of his passives he ends up getting really matters. So you notice I actually rolled 2 Cosmics, which is a fairly bad roll, because that means that he has significant extra attack, and every blocked hit is going to hurt more. And that's really going to add up, especially if I miss parries and actually block hits. That said, the basic theory of this fight works pretty much regardless of the passives you get, as proven by the fact that this is the one I mentioned to solo. I did have another run where I got better passive luck, much better passive luck actually, and I was able to get both his Careful Study 1 and his Careful Study 2 passive up, and the fight went really, really well, and then I tried to actually dodge an L1 with dexterity turned off, and I melted instantly, and that was just silly. But to go over the theory of this fight, what you want to do is basically bait out the L1s until he has that Careful Study passive, because now the damage he does with that L1 is reduced by 75%, which is why I'm blocking it for only 176. And then because of Adrenaline, because this is a rank 3 6-star, I'm getting 53 back when I hit him as long as it's quick enough. And so that brings that 176 down to just over 120, which is super manageable block damage for parrying the special. And this is where all that practice I got with Thing pays off. Now, like I said, you can try to push him to his L2. It actually works out pretty well for Reed in some ways, because if you can get the Careful Study passive up, then that's 3 more debuffs, and therefore a few hundred extra attack, and the block damage from it is somewhat mitigated by willpower healing from the concussion. The problem is that you can only parry the first hit, or at least I can only parry the first hit. Maybe there are people out there who can parry the first hit and then manage to release properly to parry the rest of the beam. If so, good for you, but there's no way I'm trying that. And that means that even if you parry the first hit, with the passives I rolled, I think the damage from the L2 is close to 3,000, which is a big chunk of the health that I have to work with. You can see that we're ahead of him on the health race here, but all it takes is a couple of those L2s or a couple parries that are missed on my end for it to start getting a lot closer. And that's why I am trying to bait out the L1 whenever possible, but because we do not want to lose those 3 pre-fights, sometimes we do have to push him to the L2, as you just saw. Now, the reason we don't want to lose those pre-fights, they are giving him extra attack, even the debuff Siphoner, which isn't really doing anything else. Suppression is meaning that we have to parry fewer of his specials by reducing his combat power rate 25%, and so that means less block damage relatively. That can be offset if you roll some of the Mystic passives on Sinister at the start of the fight, which is part of why I said that the passive luck makes a big difference, but it is helping us out. The big one, though, is the Petrify. If you've been keeping track of this, then you'll see that even though we are at 127 hits, and therefore Sinister should be regenerating 120% of the value of any crits that I land on him, because that is a 40% Petrify, because this is a 6-star read, he is losing health even on crits, which is extremely important because it means that the crit luck doesn't really matter as much, and I am slowly but surely whittling him down even if I end up critting on every single hit. You'll also notice I'm running maxed Petrify here, even with Dex off. And what that means is that if I crit on him while he's stunned, then he gets back only a small fraction of it, because that's an extra 30% reduction on top of the Petrify. We'll see if there's an example of that soon. You also can, of course, hit into his block, because that both makes him slightly more likely to throw specials, although clearly not likely enough, as you can tell there. But it also does damage to him that cannot crit, and therefore that he cannot regen even a little bit. So like I said, if you throw the Careful Study, or if you push him to the L2, then you have the possibility of getting a second Careful Study passive, and therefore of doing extra damage to Sinister. But it only turns into a passive if he throws 3 in a row. See right there, we actually blocked some hits, and see, that brought us even with his health bar. We were winning the race, and now we're even. So that's why we're trying to avoid that. But if Sinister decides to throw one L2, and then he throws an L1 instead of another L2, then you just took 3,000 block damage for no good reason, because that purifies those L2s because he didn't throw multiple ones in a row, or sorry, the debuff from the L2. And that's why, in my opinion, it's just not worth it, because if you really go for that, then you could end up pushing him to an L2, and then he throws an L1. And then you push him to an L2, you push him to a second L2, now you have 2 of those debuffs up, and then he throws an L1, and it's wasted all of your work, and you've taken almost 10,000 block damage for no real gain. So while I had one run where that did almost work out for me, I don't recommend it. Now, just now, you'll see that after parrying his L1, I threw 2 lights and then a heavy. I don't necessarily recommend that for every single special, because you're going to get more damage and therefore more mileage out of just running in and comboing him. But if the timer on those debuffs is starting to get low, and there's a possibility that he turtles instead of coming in and letting you parry him and then heavy him, and thus that you might lose those debuffs, then it is 100% worth it to do the fancy footwork to land that heavy after a special and keep them up. And you'll see that come into play quite a few times. See right there, my heavy crit and did about 9,700 damage, and then he regened for only 2,600, like 2 stacks of 1,300. That's because I'm running maxed Petrify, and so the Petrify that Mr. Fantastic put on him, in addition to the Mastery, dramatically cut his healing, and therefore I still did about 6,000 damage, even with a crit. So that's why we absolutely have to keep those debuffs up, because otherwise, while we'll still do damage to him, he'll heal more and we'll do less damage, and odds are the block damage will probably add up to a point where the solo is no longer possible. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and speed up to the end here, because it is a lot of the same, but there's something tricky to talk about at the end. So while we're wading through the body of this fight, I just want to give a quick shout out to Spinnaker 3, whose channel I will link in the description. I originally wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get this after one attempt, and he was just really helpful, talking me through, what we thought the best strategies would be, and just providing the support that I needed to really commit to making this work. So thanks for that, Spin. Go check out his channel. ton of great gameplay, especially Guardian or Mojo. Um, if you don't think Mojo is a top champion, you may just change your mind. All right, so we're back, and this is something I noticed in. I'll be honest, I tried this fight 3 different times after taking decks off, and each time when I got him below 10%, his AI shifted dramatically, and he seemed to be focusing on those special twos. And see how much damage that did into my block? That alone took me from comfortably in control of the fight to, uh-oh, I might not have enough health to finish this. And so at that point, I'm like, of course he's going to do it again. Like, there's no way he's going to throw this special when he might be able to kill me with it by just waiting. So I go for it anyway. I'm doing everything I can. I'm using my light attack whiffs after the heavy. I've hit into his block a few times, but I know I'm going to have to eat that extra special. I didn't get the parry that put me dangerously low, but we're just going to wait out the concussion to get the maximum healing from it, make sure we don't take block damage where it can't be a parry, and there it is. There's the solo. It only took 367 hits. So not even remotely a practical option, not just because you have to change your masteries, but also because of the high skill cap on it, how much RNG and AI behavior plays into the solo, and then just the fact that because of adrenaline and the fact that 6-star reads Petrify is stronger than 5-star reads, I think you really do need the rank 3 6-star for damage, for health, for adrenaline, and for the pre-fight debuffs. And there aren't very many with it. But I am happy once again that I am one of those who does have him at this rank. He is absolutely one of my favorite champions, and he rounded out the fact that the entire Fantastic Four can take this fight. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Yeah, let me know who you used. I know we've seen a lot of Sunspots, a lot of Dooms, Archangels, Torches, Warlocks, but let me know if there was anybody cool that you found worked, that you haven't seen, as popular. I'm interested to hear from you, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.